This program is made possible by listeners who choose to support Frontlines and Backrooms. You can join our community of supporters through the link in the episode description. Thank you.
From Lisbon, Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. Your host, Vladimir Bobatic.
Welcome to Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. Richard Falk is one of the most prominent scholars of international law and global order. A former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories and Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. He has spent decades examining how power shapes the rules that govern the world. From the Cold War to the post-9/11 era and into today's increasingly unstable global landscape, Falk has constantly challenged the assumption that international law operates independently of political power. In this conversation, we explore what happens when law is no longer seen as a constraint, but as an instrument. Professor Falk, thank you so much for your time and welcome to Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. If international law were applied equally to all states, powerful and weak alike, how different would the world look today?
I think it would be very different and much better. Better from the point of view of human well-being, ecological stability, and a more sensitivity to justice as well as to rules of order that are embedded in international law. But one must understand that after World War II, the winners of the war designed an architecture of world order that entrusted the management of global security to the winners of the war. And that's epitomized in the veto power given to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which in effect limits the capacity of the UN to enforce international law against the most dangerous and powerful states. The first 5 countries to acquire nuclear weapons, for instance. And so that was a fatal flaw in a world order that gave a privileged status to international law. And it has been responsible for many of the very destructive policies, not only in war-peace contexts, but also in fundamental economic relations as well.
You mentioned veto power, and lots of people are going to argue that that power is one of the main obstacles to the proper reform of the Security Council and the United Nations at all. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with it, but with limitations. One of the limitations is that even if the veto power were miraculously to be overcome, it still requires a political will to enforce international law. It's not enough that the law be declared, as it has been in relation, for instance, to the Gaza genocide by the International Court of Justice. There has to be a political will sufficient to enforce it if the losing party or the party violating international law is not prepared to comply on its own. If the decisions have to be enforced. Now, one major obstacle to getting rid of the veto is that the winners of World War II also have the need to unanimously recommend any procedures that look toward the amendment of the UN Charter. And so, therefore, it's a kind of double effect. There's the veto in the Security Council, and there's the obstacle to changing that no matter what the conditions are, unless you have this unlikely circumstance of all five veto powers agreeing to give up their privileged status within the wider conception of world order.
Professor, you know that those 5 permanent members who have a veto power are not willing to do so at this point because, for example, the United States uses this power almost always to protect Israel. Russia is using it in the same way. So they're using that power when it is in their interest or to protect itself and allies. So how we are going to change the Security Council and practically the ability of the Security Council to make meaningful decisions if those two are not willing to give up the power?
That you pose the question as if it was answerable in a positive way. There is no way within the framework of the UN to change the status of the veto, barring this unlikely willingness of the 5 permanent members to agree unanimously to do so. So it becomes, at the present stage of international relations, a almost impossibly utopian idea of reforming the UN in this fundamental respect. So it creates a pressure to find ways outside this international organization of neutralizing the belligerent behavior of these powerful states. And so it looks toward the political and economic and public responses that have not yet been forthcoming in a sufficiently influential way to challenge the behavior of the 5 winners. And with respect to the US during this period of extreme disregard of the limits, the legal and moral limits of the use of power by the US, with Trump as the narcissistic leader of the US, the UN itself has tried to appease rather than to oppose. It has given unanimous approval in the Security Council, somewhat shockingly, to the Board of Peace established by Trump to deal with the future of Gaza in a manner that rewards genocide and punishes the Palestinian victims. And achieve that kind of endorsement from the UN and the abstentions of China and Russia is a sign of the fear of provoking Trump to do something entirely irrational, which it's certainly possible that he might do. The difficulty with having this kind of narcissistic leadership in the most militarily powerful and aggressive country is that it's not possible to have any kind of limiting effect except by forceful means, and those are dangerous because they are likely to provoke a major war, possibly fought with nuclear weapons. So it's a big dilemma.
You mentioned the Board of Peace, and there are two dimensions to these questions. First, it was set by the United Nations Security Council, and second, that from Davos to Washington, it went out of the frame of the resolution. Paid permanent membership, having troops that they will deploy in Gaza, managing a reconstruction of Gaza, and everything else that will be going on over there. And additionally, President Trump said that he is not happy with the United Nations. It looks like President Trump wants to make at least a parallel institution to the United Nations, not to say to replace it. Do you have the same feeling?
Yes, I do. I think that oddly enough, Trump combines this effort to dominate the UN with an effort to undermine it simultaneously. And the more ambitious vision of the Board of Peace, as you just outlined, is an expression of a broader anti-internationalism that is characteristic of Trump's worldview and was expressed by the executive order at the beginning of 2026, in which the U.S. withdrew from no less than 66 international institutional involvements, I think 31 of which was within the UN system and included such valuable organizations as the World Health Organization and the UNESCO and the Human Rights Council, and many of the positive undertakings of the UN. The censuring of Francesca Albanese as Special Rapporteur for Occupied Palestine was the epitome of this kind of anti-internationalism when internationalism collides with a very belligerent reactionary view of American national interests. The punishment of an unpaid, courageous international civil servant, well, she's not formally an international appointee, is a symbol of this kind of double contradictory policy toward international arrangements. On the one hand, seeking to dominate them, and on the other hand, seeking to undermine them. And this is reinforced by a sense that there are no constraints that the U.S. is willing to accept beyond the private morality of its present leader. This was expressed in relation to the Iran war, where Trump said, yes, there may be something called international law, but it's subject to different interpretations. And as far as I'm concerned, my morality is the last word when it comes to that understanding of what international law is.
You mentioned Miss Francesca Albanese. If I'm not wrong, you've been in the same position as she is at the moment, so Special Rapporteur for Palestinian Territories from 2008 to 2014. She's now under the sanctions, almost like she is a terrorist. In an 18-year time span, did you think that we are going to become a world where the UN Special Rapporteur is going to be under sanctions for just doing their job and reporting from certain regions?
I certainly didn't envision that. And of course, part of the reason that she has been so victimized compared to her predecessors like myself and Michael Link is that her term coincided with the Israeli genocide in Gaza, and that gave much more visibility and was a objective repudiation of the liberal democracies that were complicit in that, in carrying out that policy. So she was dangerous in a way that we were not as predecessors. All we had to cope with was the Zionist NGO in Geneva, UN Watch, which weaponized anti-Semitism and accused me particularly of being an anti-Semite, which was a complete distortion with no evidence and a way of just practicing the politics of distraction, where you emphasize the credibility of the messenger rather than the content of the message. And that was, I think, a deliberate strategy that Israel adopted during my term, actually. They used to, prior to that, they tried to give some kind of substantive response. But they realized that was fruitless given the evidence that was overwhelming as to their violation of international humanitarian law in carrying out their duties as the occupying power. So they rather cleverly tried this other set of tactics involving deflecting attention from the occupation and its violations, leading the media and even diplomacy to concentrate on other issues.
How we came to the position that we cannot criticize one foreign government without being labeled? Why does Israel have such a privileged place in the world?
Well, I think that relates to the degree to which Israel was able to recruit wealthy donors throughout the Jewish diaspora in the world. And the so-called Israeli lobby, which is basically a Zionist pressure group, exists in all the liberal democracies, especially in Germany in view of its past, and in the US in view of the strength of this Zionist-oriented lobby that is extremely effective. And one thing to understand about American congressional politics is that where the pressure comes from only one side and the money comes from one side, and there isn't a balancing pressure from the other side, politicians have no incentive to take a principled position, and their whole careers are at stake. And AIPAC, the main pressure group, has shown its capacity to destroy politicians who are really mainstream, but take a moderate or semi-critical view of the relationship with Israel, or they're not sufficiently enthusiastic in support of Israel. It's a complete outrage that Netanyahu, the leading war criminal of our time, is invited to give no less than 5 talks to an applauding US Congress that gave him, at the last time he spoke, a year ago, I think, 59 standing ovations. It shows the degree to which American politics has been subjugated to this way of distorting foreign policy. And the Democratic Party, the supposedly liberal party, the more moderate party on foreign affairs generally, has shown no willingness to pursue a principled course of policy. And therefore, it's a situation where you have outright support for Israel and no effective opposition within the government, broadly conceived.
In the United States, it is pretty much straightforward. You have AIPAC, you know who is receiving money from AIPAC for campaigns and everything else. Here in Europe, it is a little bit different, and I wanted to ask you, why is Europe subjected to Israel? What is the reason for Europe? We don't have such a strong lobby here.
I think there's a couple of reasons. Germany, I think, is easiest to explain, that they are exceedingly sensitive to any allegation of anti-Semitism. And it has a significant Jewish minority that's sympathetic with Zionism. See, and one of the things the Zionists have successfully done is to make Jews guilty for not having gone to Israel, not having become part of the immigration to Israel. And there's a tendency to appease that guilt by supporting Israel unconditionally. The overall reason, I think, is that Europe feels vulnerable if it in any way alienates the US. And especially in this Trump period, which now coincides with the Russian attack on Ukraine, Europe feels that it doesn't want to shatter the so-called Atlantic Alliance. And even though it's under pressure from within, Canadian leader Mark Carney made an unexpected speech at the World Economic Forum in which he challenged the Atlanticist coherence and proposed a rupture in international relations by which what he called the middle powers would establish their own cohesive force. And it was within this Western framework, but still it was opposed to the US. It didn't spill over into the extra Atlanticist policy domains. Carney voiced support for the US in its war on Iran. See, despite the sensitivity to Trump's challenges to Canadian and Greenland sovereignty, when it came to extra regional concerns, he still identified primarily with the West.
When you see the latest statements from some of the European leaders, I mean, for example, the German Chancellor, who said that in the case of Iran, we should not follow international law blindly, do you have the sense that Europe is more interested in preserving the Atlantic Alliance or NATO than international law?
Oh, I think it's always been more interested. Now it's been more explicit about that interest. I think that the Atlantic Alliance was so much a matter of Cold War consensus that it didn't have to be defended in any way. Now it's more controversial because of Trump's policies that are threatening in certain ways two members of the alliance. It's necessary to generate support for the alliance and for Trump's approach by questioning objections to the Iran policy based on its violation of international law. So it's a way of supporting the U.S. at a time when the alliance itself is under pressure.
In some of your recent writing, you've talked about the moral foundations of the world order, not just laws, but the underlying values that give laws meaning. Right now, we have officials like Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, who is openly saying we don't care about so-called international organizations and stupid rules of engagement. What happens to international law when the people in charge stop even pretending to believe in it?
Well, if they fail, it leads to a certain renaissance for legal constraints and moral observance. If they succeed, it probably suppresses a meaningful opposition. So in other words, it will depend on whether these policies are perceived as successful or as failures. I think there's an increasing perception that it's going to fail, maybe not immediately, but in a short period, and that the world would be better off with a more law-respecting form of international order. And there's another way of approaching a more respected legal order, and that is for the geopolitical actors to practice a more responsible and prudent geopolitics, which China is to a large extent doing, but neither Russia nor the US are inclined to abandon their militarist geopolitics in favor of this more restrained form of international relationships. And that's quite unfortunate because, as I was saying earlier, it's not possible to change the structure of the UN. And if that structure somehow changed, a leader like Trump would abandon might even withdraw from the UN because he fundamentally is in favor of a statist imperial world order in which countries pursue their national interests And in the case of the geopolitical actors, they pursue whatever imperial ambitions they might possess. So it's national interest plus an imperial prerogative or dimension.
Now, in your last answer, you mentioned something that it would be a music to lots of ears, and that is that the United States under Donald Trump might leave the United Nations. What would remain of the United Nations be without the United States within the organization? Can the United Nations survive without the United States as an institution?
I think that's an important, generally unasked question. And of course, it depends on reading the future, and that's always a dangerous undertaking and precarious in a world of uncertainty, as our world has become. But in my view, would depend on how ready China in particular is to fill the vacuum, the funding vacuum that would be created by the US withdrawal, and to view its own future as dependent on a strong UN without the US participation. It would create more of a polycentric world with the US on one side, the BRICS on another side, and the UN, a revamped UN on a third side. And of course, that mixture is hard to know whether that would lead to a more stable international environment or a more conflictual one. It depends again on how long Trump and Trumpism would control America's foreign policy. And that depends on how, above all, less on foreign policy than on how the American people view the present leadership from their own economically dominated perspectives. And of course, Trump has already somewhat dismantled traditional American constitutionalism and is capable of dismantling it altogether and proclaiming a kind of emergency dictatorship.
Professor, you started writing about the world order in the 1960s. You've seen the Cold War and the unipolar moment, and now what looks like the unrevealing of the post-1945 system. For you personally, does this moment feel like a collapse or just another chapter in a much longer story that we are going to overcome?
Well, that's the issue sort of posed by the Carney speech that I mentioned. He posed the alternatives as transition to a new phase of the old order or a new order, either transition or rupture. And by rupture, he meant that the old order was finished and something new had to be put in its place. And the transitional scenario is that there'd be some moving around of the pieces, but the puzzle would look more or less the same. My own sense, again, is that we're locked in an atmosphere of radical uncertainty, and that it's a fool's errand to speculate on what the future holds beyond trying to depict what the alternatives are likely to be. And that leads me in the direction of thinking either that this is one more step toward a world order abyss or collapse, catastrophe, or it's a wake-up call toward a more rational, more sane kind of arrangement of power subjected to the discipline of responsible leadership and legal moral constraint.
I want to talk with you about small countries because international law for small countries, especially the global south, was the only branch that they could take in times of problems. If that disappears, what are they going to do? What leverage are they going to have in a volatile world as we have now?
Well, of course, as you say, that was their leverage in response to the Gaza genocide and to the Iran war. The only initiatives that relied on law were those that were sponsored by countries in the global south, to some extent with the sympathy of Ireland and Spain in the north. If that is removed and further weakened, it will, of course, create a post-colonial vulnerability for these countries in the South, to the extent that military superiority provides the what shall I say, the guideline, the major guideline for geopolitics and foreign policy. It was not accidental that the countries that theoretically and historically were in favor of the rule of law internationally were the ones that were silent about it when it went contrary to their geopolitical undertakings, as highlighted by Gaza and now Iran. And one notices that they used law only as a policy instrument. In other words, it was useful to denounce Russia. It was an impediment to what they were committed to doing in relation to the Palestinians and now the Iranians. So when law becomes just a policy instrument to use against your adversaries, it's really no longer law. It's policy, and it's characterized by double standards and moral hypocrisy. You expect your rivals to be law-abiding, but you denounce those that expect you to be law-abiding and morally responsible.
But, Professor, maybe you're going to agree, maybe not, but we are living in a time of moral hypocrisy. In the case of Greenland, the European Union will say you are not going to annex Greenland because we have international law. And that is the legal territory of Denmark. On the other side, international law doesn't matter that much in the case of Iran. What should be the posture of the small countries? What can they do when they see that kind of moral hypocrisy?
Well, just give one qualification to your question. International law for routine interactions among states is quite reliable. And, tourism, diplomacy, even commerce, all depend on a reliable framework of international law. What we're talking about is the ambivalent character of international law when it comes to global security or war peace type issues or fundamental questions of human rights. And it was never thought, the architects of world order in 1945 never wanted to subordinate geopolitics to the requirements of international law. And you see it also in the war crimes trials, Nuremberg and Tokyo, which only scrutinized the crimes of the losers. The crimes of the winners were never investigated, including the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you had double standards written into the peace process that followed the defeat of fascism in Europe.
You said that international law applies in most cases, like in the case of trade and everything else that you mentioned. But on the other side, we have the security of the states, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. We are talking about that part of international law. And if we are not abiding by that part of international law, then this world becomes a very scary place. Am I wrong?
No, you're right. It is a very scary place. I mean, we're living in a very scary place. We may not be fully aware of it, but it has numerous scary elements, including its more recent ecological instability and the fact that nuclear bombs are possessed by the most dangerous states in the world.
Israel has nuclear weapons. The United States has thousands, Russia, China, and some other countries as well. So when you look at the nuclear order today, is it really about non-proliferation or about who gets to have them and who doesn't?
Well, it's very much about who's allowed to get them and who's denied the opportunity. And the countries that are seeking them and denied are the countries that have the best arguments for obtaining them. And both Ukraine and Libya gave up their nuclear arsenals and were subject to international aggression, regime changing aggression in Libya's case, and a questionable effort to gain Russian sovereignty over at least the eastern parts, the eastern province, Ukraine. So I think that the real objectives of nuclear policy have been, again, to allow a hegemony among the geopolitical actors and to use nonproliferation as a way of delegitimizing states that seek nuclear weapons and waging war against the ones that you don't want to have nuclear weapons. So Israel's been allowed to acquire them, whereas Iran faces this repeated aggression because it seeks or is alleged to seek a deterrent capability, which it really reasonably requires to protect its sovereignty, as arguably North Korea managed to achieve, even though it was threatened repeatedly. And India, Pakistan are the other two countries outside the five winners of World War II that have acquired them as a sort of regional deterrent balance. and they're too big to mess around with. And the West has sort of lived with that breaking of the nuclear club, hegemonic, nuclear hegemony. See, non-proliferation is only justified if it's accompanied, as the treaty does, with disarmament, nuclear disarmament. The bargain in the treaty, which the West has completely violated, was a good faith commitment to seek nuclear disarmament.
You mentioned nuclear disarmament, and one of the last agreements between the United States and Russia expired recently. Now we have these two countries without the nuclear disarmament agreement. We have a French president, Emmanuel Macron, who has floated the idea of new nuclear armament in Europe, a process that should be led by France and Germany. We have North Korea without control over their nuclear capabilities. So, do we as civilization understand that we are just one wrong decision away from nuclear disaster?
I think that it depends how you interpret understand. I think rhetorically and sort of intellectually we understand, but existentially we behave as if there isn't any radical danger of that sort. It's a kind of typical dualism that power is imprudent about dangers to itself until they materialize, and isn't prepared to give up its strategic ambitions by adopting a prudent policy. I mean, the world was somewhat scared into prudence by the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, to the extent that the US and the Soviet Union agreed to certain forms of arms control and to communicate in crisis situations so there would not be an accidental nuclear war. It's generally observed by the most careful historical treatments of the Cuban Missile Crisis that it was just a matter of luck that a nuclear war was avoided. The Soviet submarine commander apparently ignored a order to fire a torpedo at a nuclear-armed American ship in the Caribbean waters, and that may have saved the world from an apocalyptic event.
But there is another complication, Professor, in this moment, and that is that the wars are moving into new domains: cyberstructure, cloud systems, and global digital networks. Do you think international law is capable of adapting to these new forms of conflict?
I doubt it. I don't know enough to give a detailed answer to why I doubt it, because that implies a knowledge of classified information and the ways in which these technological innovations are being adapted to military purposes. But I'm very skeptical about the capacity of the kind of political leadership that the being generated around the world, that it has the wisdom and the principled character to pursue responsible and prudent policies.
Professor, we are approaching to the end of this interview, and I have 5 rapid questions for 5 short answers. So, first question: you recently called the United States intervention in Venezuela an act of nihilistic geopolitics. In one sentence, has international law finally become just a decorative mask for imperial power?
Yes, so far as global security is concerned, remembering that international law is still very much part of what keeps routine international relations on a stable basis.
If you could perform an emergency organ transplantation on the United Nations Charter today to save the patient, which organ or which article would you replace first?
Well, probably the article that gives the permanent members of the Security Council the power to block any effort to change the organization. In other words, disallowing this kind of veto authority to extend to initiatives that would seek the amendment of the Charter.
You spent your life as a citizen pilgrim, and in 2026, it is the greatest threat to humanity, the aggressive state or the indifferent citizen.
Probably a interdependent failure of both. It's hard to calculate the degree of responsibility that those two poles of power have. I think at the present time, the peoples of the world hold more promise for a viable future than do the political elites.
I recently talked with Miss Mona Ali Khalil, and she called the Board of Peace a dangerous replacement for the United Nations. Do you see that as a final nail to the coffin of sovereignty or just last upgrade in global management?
I would hesitate to say that the assault on the UN is a major danger to world order because the UN basically has behaved so disappointedly in these recent post-Cold War crises. It's shown no capacity to impose its own charter on the behavior of the geopolitical actors. And therefore, its disappearance, as far as global security is concerned, would not be an irreparable loss. In fact, it might be a wake-up call that would prompt alternative thinking and alternative acting and leadership. So I wouldn't go along with the way she responded to that question.
By 2030, we will be living in a world of human global government governance, or we will still be navigating the ruins of Westphalian gangsterism.
Well, again, I would be reluctant to call it Westphalian gangsterism unless you attribute a hybrid character to the Westphalian world order. It's generally thought of, including in my own writing, as a statist, decentralized system of order in which national sovereignty is the prevailing norm of political arrangements. But in fact, since its beginning, it's also accepted the discretionary role of what used to be called, before the UN, great powers that never submitted their foreign policy as far as global security and strategic ambitions are concerned to the discipline of law or the ethical appeal of moral constraints. So I think that it's possible to view a more civilized version of the Westphalian vision, which was a Western imperial arrangement that was fully consistent with colonialism and was in fact the father or uncle of the European colonialism and US domination of the Western Hemisphere. So it should neither be idealized nor demonized. And finally, I don't think that one can be very hopeful about the emergence of a humane global governance system by the year 2030 unless there is an intervening catastrophe that so shakes up the elite structures and outlooks that alternative arrangements have a reasonable prospect of being implemented.
And what would be that strategic tragedy that you mentioned?
I think the two most plausible ways of thinking about that are either major war, what will be called a World War III, or an ecological collapse associated with climate change, or possibly with some kind of unanticipated ecological catastrophe.
Professor, you've been threatened, censored, called anti Semitic, and called naive. You've been kept writing, kept speaking, kept showing up. What keeps you going? Not politically, personally. What makes a 92-year-old man still sit down for an interview like this and talk about such important things?
I wish I was still 92. I'm 95. I think because I matured in an atmosphere of academic freedom and felt that part of my role as an academician was to be an engaged citizen. And most academics, including my colleagues, they felt that being any kind of activist would diminish their reputation and influence. I took the opposite path, and I have no regrets about it. I survived in a conservative university atmosphere, Princeton, for 40 years, and have since retirement continued to write and be active because I believe, I can say it in a sentimental way for the good benefit of my children and for the benefit of my country and for the potential of humanity, but it's sort of inherent, instinctive in my personality, and maybe it's a form of stubbornness that I haven't fully acknowledged, but I'm too old to change, however I appear.
Professor Falk, thank you so much for your time. It was a real pleasure and honor to have you today with us in Frontlines and Backrooms.
No, I enjoyed it, and you're a very acute poser of hard questions.
Thank you very much. If this conversation raised more questions than answers, that's where we continue. In upcoming episodes, we will explore how power is exercised beyond formal institutions, through alliances, strategy, and influence. From the limits of international law to the future of global order, including conflicts like Iran and the shifting role of the West. These conversations look at what comes next when existing frameworks no longer hold. If you value long-form conversations that go beyond headlines and soundbites, consider subscribing to support the project. It is because of listeners like you that we are able to keep this backroom dialogue independent and in-depth. You can find the link to join in the show notes.